The toast was a violation. Mr. Fletcher Carmichael raised his glass, his smile as smooth and false as a counterfeit sovereign. "To the Duke of Kestrel Chase," he purred, his eyes sliding towards the empty chair at the head of the table. "May his grief be short, and his pockets soon be deep again." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter went through the dining room. Prudence Ingram, seated at the far end of the table as a silent, negligible relation, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She did not look at the man who had spoken. She looked at the Duke. Ambrose Devereux had not moved. He stood by the great stone hearth, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, his back to the fire. The flames cast his face in unforgiving shadow, carving hollows beneath his cheekbones and deepening the lines of a sorrow too new to have settled. He had inherited the title, the debt-ridden estate of Kestrel Chase, and the crushing grief of his brother's death in the war, all within the same fortnight. He had been Duke for precisely 19 days, and already the vultures were circling. He lifted his gaze from the fire and let it travel down the long, polished table. It passed over the hopeful, simpering face of Prudence's cousin, Lavinia. It passed over the shrewd, calculating expression of her aunt, Lady Honora Ingram. It passed over the obsequious faces of tenants and local gentry, all gathered for this grim, obligatory dinner. And then, for a single, breath-stealing moment, his eyes met Prudence's. She had expected to see fury, or perhaps the blank despair of a man overwhelmed. Instead, she saw a chilling stillness, an unnerving clarity. It was the look of a commander on a battlefield, assessing his losses not with emotion, but with a cold, hard calculus. In that moment, she knew two things. First, that Mr. Carmichael had just made a grave error. And second, that this Duke, unlike his profligate father, saw everything. "Mr. Carmichael," Ambrose said, his voice quiet but carrying across the suddenly silent room. It was not a shout. It was something far more unnerving, a statement of fact. "My brother's memory is not a subject for wit, and my pockets are not a subject for public speculation." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The authority in it was absolute. "You will leave my house." A collective gasp. Lady Honora's hand flew to her pearls. Carmichael's face, a moment before so smug, became a mottled mask of disbelief and rage. "Your Grace," he stammered, half rising from his chair. "It was a jest. A poor one, I admit, but—" "Now," Ambrose said. The word was a chip of ice. There was no arguing with it. Humiliated, sputtering, Fletcher Carmichael threw down his napkin and stormed from the room, the great oak doors closing behind him with a boom that echoed like a cannon shot. An excruciating silence fell. It was Prudence's aunt who broke it, her voice a high, nervous trill. "Well, such dramatics! Your Grace, you must forgive our friend. His devotion sometimes makes him clumsy." Ambrose's gaze settled on her, and for the first time, Prudence saw her aunt truly flinch. "He is no friend of mine, Lady Honora, and I do not suffer clumsiness in my accounts, financial or social." He turned his back to the room then, facing the fire once more, a clear dismissal of them all. The dinner party was over. Later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, Prudence could not sleep. The scene replayed in her mind. The Duke's quiet power, the stark reality of the estate's peril that Carmichael's crass toast had laid bare. Her aunt had brought them to Kestrel Chase with one goal: to secure the new, wealthy duke for her beautiful daughter, Lavinia. Lady Honora spoke of it as a foregone conclusion, as if a title were a ripe plum ready for the plucking. But Prudence, who for years had secretly managed her aunt's chaotic finances, knew the scent of desperation and impending ruin. She had seen it in their own dwindling accounts. She saw it now, written in the very bones of this grand, neglected house. She slipped out of her small, cold bedroom, a candle in her hand. Her aunt and cousin were housed in a guest suite with a fire and thick carpets. Prudence was in a forgotten room in the north wing, with a draught that whispered through the window frame and a mattress filled with what felt like corn husks. She was used to it. She was the poor relation, the unpaid secretary, the useful, invisible appendage to her glamorous relatives. Her existence was one of quiet competence, a life lived in the margins of ledgers and the shadows of drawing rooms. She knew she should not do it, but the pull was irresistible. The Duke's study, the heart of the estate. She had seen him go in there after the disastrous dinner, had seen the single line of light under the door until well past midnight. Now it was dark. She pushed the heavy door, which swung inward without a sound on well-oiled hinges. The room smelled of old paper, beeswax, and the faint masculine scent of leather and cloves. A sliver of moonlight cut across a massive desk, illuminating stacks of papers, bound ledgers, and threatening letters with broken red seals. It was a portrait of chaos. Bills from London merchants, demands from lenders, reports from a bailiff that spoke of failing crops and tenants unable to pay their rent. Prudence set her candle down, her fingers itching. This was a language she understood. This was a puzzle she knew how to solve. For 5 years, since her own father's death had left her a ward of her spendthrift aunt, she had performed this same sad magic, turning the dross of her aunt's debts and extravagances into a semblance of solvency. She did it with a small, worn leather notebook and a mind that held figures with perfect clarity. It was her only skill and her cage. Drawn by an instinct she couldn't name, she reached for the topmost ledger. Its cover was thick with dust. She blew it away in a soft gray cloud and opened it. The handwriting was a lazy, arrogant scrawl, the late Duke's, she presumed. The columns were a disaster. Numbers were transposed, entries were missing. Vast sums were allocated to sundries and personal expenses. It was not mere mismanagement. It was a deliberate, almost gleeful obfuscation. It was designed to hide the truth. She lost track of time. The candle burned low, its wax pooling on the desk. She forgot where she was, forgot the risk. She was simply working. Her mind, so often dulled by the petty tyrannies of her aunt, sharpened to a fine point. She saw the patterns, the discrepancies, the ghost-like figures of debts that appeared and disappeared. She saw the name F. Carmichael repeated over and over, linked to loans with exorbitant interest rates and invoices for goods that seemed impossibly overpriced. A web of deceit spun over years. And at its center, Kestrel Chase, being slowly bled dry. "What do you think you are doing?" The voice came from the darkness behind her. It was the Duke's, low, cold, and utterly devoid of surprise. Prudence froze, her heart seizing in her chest. She did not scream or gasp. She had learned long ago that such displays were useless. Slowly, she closed the ledger and turned on the stool to face him. He stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the deeper darkness of the hall. He wasn't holding a lamp. He had been standing there for some time, watching her. "Your Grace," she said, her own voice a quiet echo in the vast room. Her hands, resting on the dusty ledger, were perfectly still. She would not cry. She would not beg. She would state the truth and accept the consequences. "I was looking at your accounts." He moved into the room, his footsteps silent on the thick Aubusson carpet. He stopped on the other side of the desk, the moonlight now catching the silver threads in his dark hair. He looked at the ledger, at the other papers she had inadvertently neatened into piles, and then back at her face, pale in the candlelight. "Why?" he asked. It was not an accusation, it was a genuine question. Prudence thought of a dozen possible answers. A polite lie, a demure apology. Instead, she gave him the truth, as plain and unadorned as her dress. "Because they are wrong," she said. "Deeply wrong. And because Mr. Carmichael's name appears far too often, always to his benefit and never to yours." A long silence stretched between them. The candle flame flickered, casting their shadows dancing on the walls. She expected him to be angry, to dismiss her as an impertinent, meddling woman. She expected to be sent from his house in disgrace in the morning. Instead, he pulled a chair from the corner and sat down opposite her, the great desk between them. He gestured to the ledger. "Show me," Ambrose Devereux said. And in that moment, Prudence Ingram's life, which had been a long, quiet exercise in enduring, began to turn towards the act of choosing. For the next hour, under the watchful gaze of the Duke, Prudence spoke. She did not use the flowery, apologetic language of a woman trespassing in a man's domain. She used the language of numbers. She pointed to entries with a steady finger. "This sum, for wine from Bordeaux, is 3 times the market rate. The bill of lading is signed by a clerk in Mr. Carmichael's employ. Here, a loan for £500 taken in March, with interest calculated not annually, but quarterly, at a rate that is frankly usurious. And this," she said, her voice dropping, "this is the most telling." She indicated a series of payments to a London solicitor, ostensibly for legal services. But the dates corresponded precisely with the sale of a small parcel of land on the estate's northern edge. There was no record of the income from that sale, not a single shilling. "The money from the land sale vanished," she said plainly. "And these payments were made to the very solicitor who handled the transaction, a man known to be Carmichael's creature. It appears the estate paid for the privilege of having its own assets stolen." Ambrose listened without interruption. His eyes never left her face, but his focus was absolute, his mind absorbing every detail. He did not seem shocked by the corruption, only by the clarity with which she exposed it. He had known, in a broad, overwhelming sense, that things were dire. He had felt the estate crumbling around him like a house of sand, but she was giving his formless dread a name, a shape, a series of numbers that could be confronted. When she finished, the candle had nearly guttered out. The first pale gray light of dawn was seeping through the tall library windows. Prudence folded her hands in her lap, her work done. She felt strangely calm. She had spoken the truth. The rest was not in her hands. "You are Miss Ingram," he stated. "Lady Honora's niece." "Yes, Your Grace." "And you have been managing your aunt's affairs." It was not a question. "Yes." She did not elaborate on the misery of that task, the endless battle against extravagance and denial. She did not need to. He would understand. He rose and walked to the window, looking out over the dew-drenched lawns of Kestrel Chase. The estate was beautiful, a rolling expanse of parkland and ancient woods, but it was a beauty that masked a deep sickness. "My steward, Mr. Ogilvy, is an old man. Honest, I believe, but overwhelmed. His deputy I do not trust. The books he has shown me are neat falsehoods, polite evasions. What you have shown me is the truth." He turned back to face her. "Lady Honora brought you here in the hope that I would marry your cousin." Prudence's cheeks warmed, but she met his gaze. "That is my aunt's hope, yes." "It will not be realized," he said. Not cruelly, but with the simple finality he had used on Carmichael. "I have no intention of marrying anyone. I have a war to fight right here. This estate is my battlefield, and I am losing." He paused, his eyes narrowing as a thought took shape. "I need a steward, a true one, someone with a mind for this kind of warfare, someone loyal only to Kestrel Chase, not to its history of indulgence, someone no one would suspect." Prudence's heart began to beat a little faster. She did not dare to hope. She did not dare to understand what he was implying. "It is an impossible proposition," he said, more to himself than to her. "Scandalous, unheard of. But I am a desperate man, and desperate men do not have the luxury of convention." He looked directly at her, his gaze piercing. "You have a small inheritance, do you not? From your father, one which your aunt controls." Prudence nodded, a lump forming in her throat. The 800 pounds left to her was her only hope of eventual freedom, a hope that grew more distant with every one of her aunt's millinery bills. "I will pay it to you," he said. "Directly. Double it. 1,600 pounds, placed in an account in your name in London. Enough for you to be independent of your aunt forever. In return, you will work for me, in secret. You will be my steward. You will unravel this mess. You will identify every debt, every swindle, every penny owed, and every penny stolen. You will give me the weapons I need to save this place." The room was utterly still. The audacity of his proposal hung in the air between them. For her, it was freedom. For him, it was survival. A transactional, impossible alliance. "Your aunt will remain here as a guest with your cousin," he continued, his voice low and strategic. "Their presence will provide your cover. You will be the quiet niece, the companion. No one must know what you are truly doing. You will have this office at night. During the day, I will find a way to give you access to the estate offices. We will speak only when necessary. The terms are plain. Your skill for your freedom." Prudence thought of her life, a gray tapestry of servitude, of being overlooked, undervalued, used. She thought of her aunt's casual cruelty, of Lavinia's shallow pity. She thought of the future that awaited her, a slow descent into impoverished spinsterhood, always dependent on the charity of others. Then she looked at the Duke. He was not offering her kindness or pity. He was offering her something far more valuable: recognition, a task worthy of her mind. He was offering her a weapon to forge her own escape. "My aunt will not approve," she said quietly. "I am not asking for her approval," he replied. "I am asking for yours. Will you do it?" He saw the light dawn in her eyes, the subtle shift from endurance to resolve. He was a man who prized evidence, and the evidence before him was a woman of extraordinary, hidden competence. He had made his offer. He waited for her answer. Let her pretend to be a steward, he had thought, a plan forming with desperate speed as he watched her in the moonlight. Now, He waited for her to agree to the pretense. Prudence took a slow breath. She looked at the desk, at the mountain of paper that represented the Duke's ruin and her potential salvation. Then she looked at him. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady as a newly struck bell. "Plainly, yes." The arrangement began the next day. To the rest of the household, nothing had changed. Prudence was still the quiet, mousy girl who trailed in the wake of her vibrant cousin and formidable aunt. She still sat in drawing rooms with her needlework, her eyes downcast, a model of poor relation humility. But her mind was miles away, sifting through columns of figures, cross-referencing dates, and committing discrepancies to her flawless memory. Ambrose was as good as his word. He announced that he required a new inventory of the entire household, a task he deemed too tedious for his aging steward. He assigned it to Miss Ingram, at Lady Honora's suggestion, who thought it a suitably menial and time-consuming task to keep her niece occupied and out of sight. "Prudence has a wonderful head for details," she had said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "She will be of great use." It was the perfect cover. Armed with a clipboard and a series of notebooks, Prudence was granted access to every corner of Kestrel Chase. She moved from the wine cellars to the attics, from the linen closets to the stables, counting, recording, assessing. The official inventory was for the Duke. The real inventory was for her. With every tally of silver spoons, every count of damask tablecloths, she was mapping the estate's vulnerabilities. She spoke to the staff, not with the condescension of a visiting lady, but with the quiet curiosity of a fellow worker. Her first true ally was the housekeeper, Mrs. Hannah Abbott. A stern, raw-boned woman who had served Kestrel Chase for 30 years, she was fiercely loyal to the house, if not to its late master. Initially, she treated Prudence with a wary suspicion, seeing another flighty guest making work for her staff. "You'll find the china in the main pantry, miss," she said, her tone clipped. "Be careful with it. The Meissen is delicate." "Thank you, Mrs. Abbott," Prudence replied. "I am less concerned with the Meissen than with the household accounts for beeswax and soap. The last order seems excessive for a house in mourning." Mrs. Abbott's eyebrows shot up. She looked at Prudence, truly looked at her for the first time. She saw not a simpering girl, but a woman with a keen, intelligent gaze. "Excessive is one word for it," the housekeeper said, her voice lowering. "Thefts is another. The under-butler, Perkins, has a cousin who owns a chandlery in Marley. Funny how our stocks run low, just as his seem to flush." It was the first thread. Prudence made a note. She did not gossip or promise action. She simply listened. That evening, in the Duke's study, she presented the fact to him. "The beeswax. It is being stolen." Ambrose, staring into the fire, nodded slowly. "Fire, Perkins," he said. "No, Your Grace," Prudence countered quietly. "Not yet. A man like that is a symptom, not the disease. Firing him will only alert the true culprit that the house is waking up. For now, we watch. We document. We wait." He turned to look at her, a flicker of something, respect, in his dark eyes. He was a man used to giving orders and having them obeyed instantly. Her counsel was unexpected. And correct. "Very well, Miss Ingram. We wait." And so, Prudence's quiet transformation of Kestrel Chase began. It started not with grand pronouncements, but with small, almost invisible acts of restoration. She discovered that the staff was being paid from a dozen different, disorganized funds, their wages often late. She consolidated the payroll, ensuring every footman and housemaid was paid on time, in full. It was a simple act of decency, but in a house accustomed to chaos, it was revolutionary. Loyalty began to shift. Whispers in the servants' hall turned from gossip about the guests to grudging admiration for the quiet Miss Ingram. One afternoon, exploring the grounds behind the kitchens, she found a neglected herb garden. It was choked with weeds, the stone borders crumbling, but she could see the ghosts of what it had been. Neat rows of thyme, rosemary, sage, and mint. The cook complained of the expense of buying dried herbs from the village. Without asking permission, Prudence spent an hour every morning, before the rest of the house was awake, in that garden. She pulled weeds, her hands bare. She turned the soil. She found old, half-dead rosemary bushes and carefully pruned them back to life. Gil, a young groom, saw her one morning and, without a word, returned with a barrow and a spade. He helped her clear the worst of the overgrowth. It was another domino falling. Ambrose watched her from his study window. He saw her kneeling in the dirt, her brow furrowed in concentration, a smudge of earth on her cheek. She was supposed to be a lady of leisure, waiting for a suitable match. Instead, she was coaxing life from dead ground. The sight stirred something in him, a feeling he had thought long buried with his brother. It was not pity. It was a strange, protective warmth. His house had been as cold and silent as his heart. Now, in small, almost imperceptible ways, this quiet, determined woman was bringing both back to life. The herb garden became a symbol of her work. As the first green shoots of thyme and parsley pushed through the dark soil, so too did the first signs of order emerge from the estate's tangled finances. Prudence worked relentlessly. At night, in the study, she built her case, ledger by ledger. She created a new set of books, her own, in which every transaction was recorded with painstaking accuracy. Her worn leather notebook, once the secret record of her aunt's folly, now held the key to a duke's salvation. Their meetings were brief, formal, and focused entirely on the task at hand. "The income from the east pastures is down by half," she would report, presenting a page of figures. "The tenant, Mr. Yardley, claims blight, but the neighboring farms report a bumper crop of hay." "Yardley is Carmichael's man," Ambrose would say, his voice grim. "He is also 2 years in arrears on a loan from a bank in which Mr. Carmichael holds a significant interest," Prudence would add, producing another document. "I believe he is being squeezed. The profits are being diverted before they ever reach your accounts." He began to look forward to these late-night counsels. He found a strange comfort in her calm, logical presence. She did not flatter him or defer to him. She presented him with facts, with evidence. She treated him not as a duke, but as a partner in a difficult enterprise. He started asking her opinion on matters beyond the books. A dispute between tenants, a request from the vicar. Her advice was always sensible, always rooted in fairness and practicality. One evening he found her not at the desk, but standing by the bookshelf, her hand resting on a worn volume of poetry. "My brothers," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "He was the reader. I was the soldier." Prudence turned, her expression gentle. "Grief is a debt that must be paid, Your Grace. It cannot be outrun." He had received endless letters of condolence, full of empty platitudes. Her simple words, offered without sentiment, were the first to bring him any measure of peace. It was in that moment he realized his transactional arrangement with Miss Ingram was becoming something far more complicated. He had hired a steward. He was discovering a confidant. He had offered her freedom, but she, in turn, was offering him something he had not realized he'd lost: hope. And this quiet, burgeoning hope was a more dangerous and precious commodity than any sum of money. The thought was unsettling. He was a man who valued control, and his feelings for the quiet woman in his study were becoming decidedly difficult to manage. The more progress Prudence made, the more threatened the old guard became. Fletcher Carmichael, though banished from the Duke's table, was not a man to accept defeat. He had profited from the chaos of Kestrel Chase for years, and he viewed Prudence's quiet efficiency as a direct assault on his income. Lady Honora, meanwhile, saw her ambitions crumbling. The Duke remained polite but icily distant to Lavinia, showing far more interest in his dusty ledgers than in her daughter's pretty accomplishments. She began to view Prudence not as a useful drudge, but as an obstacle. The opposition began with whispers. In the nearby town of Marley, rumors began to circulate. The new Duke, it was said, was a recluse, a miser, entirely under the thumb of his mother's penniless niece. They said Prudence Ingram was a grasping, ambitious woman who had bewitched him, turning him against his father's old and trusted friends. The whispers were like poison ivy, creeping through the town, turning public opinion against the new regime at Kestrel Chase. Lady Theodosia Fenwick, a formidable dowager whose estate bordered the Duke's, heard the rumors and came to see for herself. She was a woman whose tongue was as sharp as her mind, and she did not suffer fools. She arrived one afternoon for tea, her eyes missing nothing. She observed Lavinia's vapid chatter, Lady Honora's cloying flattery, and Prudence's quiet, watchful stillness. "So, you are the talk of the county, Miss Ingram," Lady Theodosia said, her voice a dry rasp. "They say you have the Duke's ear. A dangerous place for an unmarried woman to be." "I merely assist His Grace with some household correspondence, Lady Theodosia," Prudence replied, her voice even. Correspondence," the old woman snorted. "I knew his father, a charming fool who would have sold the lead off the roof for a new set of racehorses. The son seems a different animal entirely. Colder, harder. I should think he has little time for correspondence." She peered at Prudence over her teacup. "Be careful, girl. Men like Carmichael do not relinquish their prey easily." It was a warning, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, a grudging respect. The slander escalated. Carmichael, working through Lady Honora, struck at Prudence's most vulnerable point, her reputation. Lady Honora began expressing concerns to her friends about her niece's long hours spent closeted with the Duke. "She is so devoted, poor girl," she would sigh, dabbing at a dry eye. "But a young woman, alone with a man of his station, one worries what people might say." The insinuation was clear and venomous. Ambrose heard the rumors and was filled with a cold rage. He wanted to ride into Marley and call out every man who dared to speak her name. But he knew it would only make things worse, lending credence to the gossip. Prudence, when she heard the whispers repeated by a tearful housemaid, showed no emotion at all. She had been weathering her aunt's malice for years. This was merely a larger, more public version of it. "It is a tactic to distract you, Your Grace," she told him during one of their nightly meetings. "They attack me because they cannot attack your logic. We must not be baited. We must focus on the evidence." Her composure only deepened his admiration, and the protective feeling he felt for her intensified. It was becoming a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of his thoughts. He found himself watching for her in the halls, listening for the sound of her light footstep. He told himself it was because she was essential to his plans. It was a lie, and he knew it. Then Carmichael made his move. It was a direct, calculated attack, designed not just to discredit Prudence, but to destroy her completely. He conspired with the under-steward, a man whose own petty thefts Prudence had already uncovered and documented. Together, they forged a bill of sale. It was for a set of rare Gobelin tapestries that had hung in the West Gallery for a century. The document showed the tapestries sold to a dealer in London for a paltry sum, with the payment made directly to a bank account. The account was in the name of P. Ingram. The understeward, feigning horrified discovery, brought the document to Ambrose. He laid it on the desk in the study, his face a mask of false concern. "Your Grace, I found this misplaced in the estate office. I cannot believe it to be true. Miss Ingram has always seemed so trustworthy." We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Ambrose looked at the document. The forgery was expert. The signature was a credible imitation of Prudence's neat, precise hand. The details were plausible. It was a damning piece of evidence. For a single, terrible moment, a sliver of doubt pierced his certainty. He was a man who relied on evidence. He had trained himself, in war and now in this bitter peace, to suppress emotion and trust what was written on the page. And the page before him was a clear indictment. He thought of her father's inheritance, the £1,600 he had promised her. Had it not been enough? Had she, like everyone else in his life, succumbed to the lure of easy money? The thought was a physical blow, leaving him winded. It was not the loss of the tapestries that mattered. It was the potential loss of the one person he had begun to trust. He locked the forged bill of sale in his desk drawer. He did not summon Prudence that night. The light under his study door burned until dawn, but the room remained empty save for him and his burgeoning doubt. The house felt cold again. The silence, which had become companionable, was once more a hollow, lonely thing. He was at war, and he felt, for the first time since she had entered his life, that he was fighting it alone. Ambrose's perspective. The paper felt foul in his hand, a lie made tangible. Ambrose sat at his desk, the forged bill of sale lying before him like a dead thing. He stared at the name P. Ingram and felt a cold fury mix with a deeper, more painful emotion he refused to name. For weeks he had allowed himself a sliver of hope. He had watched Prudence Ingram move through his broken world like a surgeon, her touch precise, her purpose clear. She had asked for nothing for herself, save the freedom that was her right. He had built his entire strategy for saving Kestrel Chase around the bedrock of her integrity. If that foundation was sand, then everything would collapse. He remembered the first night, finding her here in this room. She had not been afraid. She had been caught, like a scholar interrupted in her work. There had been no artifice in her, no feminine wiles, none of the cloying sweetness his aunt and cousin deployed like siege weapons. She had simply offered him the truth, a commodity so rare in his world he had almost forgotten what it looked like. Was it all a lie? A more subtle, more intelligent deception than any he had encountered before? Was she just a cleverer version of Fletcher Carmichael, playing a longer game? The evidence in front of him suggested it. His training, his experience, his cynicism, all screamed at him to believe the paper. But then he thought of her in the herb garden, her hands stained with dirt, a look of fierce concentration on her face as she tended a half-dead plant. He thought of the way she spoke to the servants, with a quiet respect that had earned their fierce loyalty. He thought of her clear, steady eyes meeting his across this very desk, her voice calm as she unraveled years of deceit. These were not the actions of a common thief. He got up and paced the room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Doubt was a poison. It had rotted his father's estate from the inside out. It had made him cold and distant, trusting no one after the loss of his brother, whose open, generous nature had been so betrayed by the world. Was he now to let that same poison corrupt this fragile, essential alliance? He stopped before the window. The moon was high, casting the grounds in silver and black. He could just make out the shape of the little herb garden, a neat, dark patch against the wilder lawn. She had brought order to it. She had brought order to his house. She had brought a quiet order to the chaos in his own mind. A thief would have taken things of immediate value, jewels, silver. They would have been clumsy. Prudence Ingram was never clumsy. She was precise. A forger clever enough to create this document would not make the mistake of using a bank account that could be so easily traced back to her. It was too obvious, too neat. It was a trap. Not laid by her, but for her. The realization settled over him, cold and hard and certain. He had been a fool to doubt her, even for a moment. This was Carmichael's handiwork, an act of desperation from a cornered rat. His fury returned, but now it had a clear target. He would not confront her with accusation. That would be an insult to her, and to himself. It would mean that he valued a piece of paper over the evidence of his own eyes, over the testimony of her character that she had provided every single day. He would present her with a problem to be solved, just as he had with every other piece of the puzzle. He would give her the lie, and he would trust her to dismantle it with the truth. He would show her that his faith in her was not so easily broken. He owed her that. He owed it to himself. He went back to the desk, picked up the forged document, and folded it carefully. Tomorrow he would not ask her for a confession. He would ask her for a strategy. He would show her the weapon the enemy had forged, and together they would turn it back upon them. The coldness in his chest receded, replaced by a grim, unwavering resolve. The battle for Kestrel Chase had just entered its most dangerous phase, and he would not face it alone. The next evening, Prudence entered the study to find the Duke standing by the window, his back to her. The room was colder than usual. The fire had not been lit. A sense of foreboding prickled her skin. He had not sent for her the previous night, the first time their nightly ritual had been broken. She had told herself he was busy, but a sliver of unease had taken root. "Your Grace?" she said quietly. He turned. His face was unreadable, carved from stone. "Miss Ingram." He walked to the desk and laid a single sheet of paper on the polished wood. "Explain this." It was not an accusation. It was a command. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Prudence stepped forward and looked at the document. She read it once, then twice. A bill of sale for the Gobelin tapestries, a pittance of a price, a payment made to an account in her name. A cold dread, far worse than the fear of being caught in the library, washed over her. This was not a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, malevolent act of destruction aimed directly at her. Her name, her reputation, her very existence at Kestrel Chase, all of it was threatened by this single, elegant lie. She did not gasp. She did not weep. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. She lifted her eyes from the forgery and met the Duke's gaze. She was searching for a sign of what he believed. Did he see a thief? A traitor? But his expression was a perfect, impenetrable mask. He was waiting. He was testing her. This was the crisis, the moment upon which everything turned. Her future, her freedom, the fragile, unspoken trust that had grown between them. It was all balanced on the point of a pin. and her only defense was the truth. "It is a forgery," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It was as calm and factual as if she were discussing the price of corn. "The signature is a convincing likeness of your own," he stated, his eyes still locked on hers. "It is," she agreed. "The forger is skilled, but he is not infallible. May I?" She gestured to the paper. He nodded. She picked it up, her touch light. Her mind, sharpened by years of spotting discrepancies, went to work. This was just another puzzle, another set of false accounts to be dismantled. "The paper is from a London stationer," she observed, "of a higher quality than any used in the estate office. The ink is iron gall, but it lacks the slight fading one would expect of a document supposedly 2 months old. It smells fresh." She held it closer. "And here," she pointed to the bottom of the page, "the watermark. It is the mark of a papermaker who only began trading last month. This document could not possibly have been created 2 months ago." Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her voice remained a steady, quiet instrument of logic. She laid the paper back on the desk. Then, she did the one thing he did not expect. She went to the bookshelf, retrieved a heavy estate atlas, and opened it on the desk beside the forgery. She turned to a detailed map of the Kestrel Chase lands. "But the most compelling evidence against me is not in the forgery itself, Your Grace. It is here." She pointed to the West Gallery on the architectural plan. "The Gobelin tapestries were a gift to your great-grandmother. They are magnificent, but they have suffered from damp for years. I noted it in my initial inventory." She then produced her own small, worn notebook, the true ledger of Kestrel Chase. She flipped through the pages. "Here is my entry. West Gallery, 6 Gobelin tapestries. Significant mildew and moth damage to the lower third of all panels. Estimated cost of restoration, £400. They are, in their current state, virtually worthless to a reputable dealer. Only a fool or a scoundrel would buy them in this condition." She looked up at him, her quiet defense complete. She had not pleaded or protested her innocence. She had proven it. A long silence filled the room. Then the granite mask of his face finally cracked. A slow, faint smile touched his lips, though it did not reach his eyes. His eyes held something else entirely. Profound relief. "I knew it," he said, his voice low. "I knew it was a lie." Prudence felt a wave of dizziness. He had believed her. Even before she had spoken, he had believed her. The knot of fear in her chest dissolved, replaced by a warmth that spread through her limbs. "You did?" "The entire fabrication was too clumsy for you, Miss Ingram," he said. "Too obvious. It was an act of desperation. Carmichael's, I presume?" He picked up the forged document and, with a single, decisive motion, tore it in half, then in quarters, and dropped the pieces into the cold hearth. "He has made a fatal error. He has revealed his methods, and he has given us the means to expose him." His energy filled the room, the cold stasis replaced by a sudden, sharp sense of purpose. "This is no longer a defensive war, Miss Ingram. It is time for an attack. I will call a meeting of my primary tenants and creditors, here, in 3 days. I want every one of Carmichael's misdeeds, every stolen shilling, every fraudulent bill, laid bare. I want evidence, irrefutable. Can you do it?" The "we" and the "us" echoed in her heart. It was no longer her skill for her freedom. It was a partnership. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound confidence. I can. For the next 3 days, they worked. They did not sleep. Mrs. Abbott, now a staunch and knowing co-conspirator, brought them trays of food and endless pots of coffee, guarding the study door like a dragon. Prudence spread her ledgers, her notebooks, her collected evidence across the vast desk. It was a mosaic of deceit, and she was the one who could read its pattern. Ambrose worked beside her, his legal training providing a framework for her financial discoveries. He drafted statements, organized affidavits from tenants Prudence had identified as victims of Carmichael's schemes, and dispatched a rider to London to get a sworn statement from the papermaker whose watermark had exposed the forgery. They worked in a state of intense, focused intimacy. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same document, their heads bent close together over a single column of figures, his dark hair almost touching her simpler brown braid. He learned the scent of her, a faint aroma of old paper, lavender soap, and the herbs from her garden. She learned the rhythms of his concentration, the way he would rub the back of his neck when deep in thought, the quiet intensity of his gaze. They spoke little, but a new language was forming between them, a language of shared purpose, mutual respect, and a trust that had been tested by fire and had emerged as strong as steel. The day of the reckoning arrived. The great dining room, the scene of Carmichael's initial humiliation, was prepared. But this was not a dinner party. It was an assembly, a court of sorts. Ambrose stood once more before the great hearth, but this time he was not a grieving son. He was a duke in full command of his house. The room was filled with the county's most important figures, tenants, bankers, the local magistrate, and, in a place of honor, Lady Theodosia Fenwick, her expression as sharp and curious as a hawk's. Lady Honora and Lavinia were also present, seated to one side. Honora looked triumphant, certain she was about to witness her niece's downfall and her own subsequent rise. Fletcher Carmichael entered last, his demeanor smug and confident. He nodded to his allies in the room, smiling like a man about to foreclose on a mortgage. He took a seat at the center of the long table, directly opposite the Duke. He believed he was the guest of honor. He was, in fact, the accused. Ambrose began. His voice was calm, measured, judicial. I have called you here today to discuss the future of Kestrel Chase. For many years, this estate has been managed under a cloud of confusion and debt. I have undertaken a full review of its finances. I have not done it alone. He turned and gestured to the doorway. I have had the assistance of a most able and meticulous steward. The door opened, and Prudence entered. She was not dressed as the mousy companion. She wore a simple, dark gray gown, severe and businesslike. Her hair was pulled back neatly. In her hands, she carried her ledgers. She did not look at her stunned and furious aunt. She did not look at Carmichael, whose face had gone rigid with shock. She walked to the place set for her at the table, beside the Duke's chair, and calmly set down her books. A murmur went through the room. Lady Theodosia leaned forward, a glint of pure delight in her old eyes. Mr. Carmichael, Ambrose said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. You have been a friend to this house for many years, a lender, an advisor. So you, more than anyone, will be interested in what my steward has discovered. He nodded to Prudence. It was her moment. All those years of silent, thankless work, of biting her tongue, of enduring humiliation, it had all led to this. She stood, opened the first ledger, and began to speak. Her voice was clear, steady, and utterly devastating. She started with the wine, explaining the inflated invoices. She moved to the usurious loans, showing the calculations that proved their illegality. She called forth the evidence of the stolen land sale, producing correspondence she had unearthed from a dusty chest in the attic. One by one, she dismantled Fletcher Carmichael's empire of fraud. She presented facts, figures, dates. She named clerks, solicitors, and delivery men. Her memory was a flawless weapon, her ledgers the unanswerable proof. Carmichael began to bluster. "This is preposterous! Lies concocted by a hysterical, ambitious female. She has bewitched him." "Are these lies, Mr. Carmichael?" Prudence asked, her voice cutting through his tirade. She held up a new document, the sworn statement from the London papermaker. "This is an affidavit confirming that the paper used to forge a bill of sale for the Gobelin tapestries, a forgery intended to frame me for theft, was not manufactured until last month. A clumsy error. But then, desperation makes one clumsy." The magistrate leaned forward, his expression grim. "Forgery is a serious accusation, Miss Ingram. A criminal one." "Indeed," Ambrose said smoothly. "And one we can prove. The understeward, when faced with this evidence, has provided a full confession of his part in the scheme, and has named Mr. Carmichael as its author." The room erupted. Carmichael's face was a ruin, his composure shattered. He looked around for support, but his allies were staring at their hands, distancing themselves from his disgrace. Lady Honora had gone pale, her mouth a thin, hard line. She saw her ambitions, her plans, her entire future turning to ash. It was Lady Theodosia who delivered the final blow. She rose to her feet, her small frame radiating immense authority. "I have heard enough," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "I have seen years of mismanagement and decay at this estate under the guidance of men like Fletcher Carmichael. Today, I have seen clarity, honesty, and courage from this young woman. I, for one, stand with the Duke and his remarkable steward. Kestrel Chase is in good hands at last." She looked directly at Carmichael, her eyes chips of flint. "You, sir, are a disgrace to this county." The public reckoning was complete. Carmichael, exposed and ruined, stumbled from the room, the magistrate following closely behind. The case against him was ironclad. His financial and social ruin was absolute. Lady Honora, realizing the game was lost, tried to salvage some dignity. "Prudence, I cannot believe you would engage in such public theatrics," she began, but Ambrose cut her off. "Lady Honora," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "your presence at Kestrel Chase is no longer required. My carriage will be ready to return you and your daughter to your own home within the hour." It was a final, quiet, and complete dismissal. The room cleared, leaving only Ambrose and Prudence standing in the sudden silence. The battle was over. They had won. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the aftermath of the storm. Prudence felt a profound exhaustion, but also a lightness she had never known. She had not been rescued. She had, with her own mind and her own courage, secured her own victory. Ambrose came to stand before her. The formal duke, the cold commander was gone. In his place was the man she had worked with, the man who had trusted her. "The debt to your aunt will be paid," he said softly. "The £1,600 will be in your account by week's end. You are free, Prudence." He used her first name. It landed in the quiet room with the weight of a vow. She looked up at him, her heart full. "Thank you, Ambrose." He reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm, firm, a grounding force. "Your work as my steward is concluded," he said, his thumb gently tracing a line over her knuckles. "The position is now redundant." A pang of loss, sharp and unexpected, went through her. It was over. She had her freedom, but it meant she would have to leave this house. Leave him. She had brought the cold, silent rooms back to life, and in doing so, had found a life for herself. The thought of returning to a world without Kestrel Chase, without their shared purpose, was suddenly unbearable. "However," he continued, his voice dropping lower, his gaze intense and full of a feeling he no longer tried to hide, "I find that I cannot run this estate, or this house, or my life without you. The partnership we have formed, it is the most valuable asset I possess." He took her other hand, holding both of hers between his own. "I am not offering you employment, Prudence Ingram. I am asking you to stay. I am asking you to share the burden and the victory. Not as my steward." He paused, and then, in the great dining room where she had been vindicated, Ambrose Devereux, the Duke of Kestrel Chase, went down on one knee before his steward. "But as my wife, as my Duchess, as my partner, together." Tears, which she had refused to shed in fear or humiliation, finally came. They were not tears of sadness, but of a joy so profound it was painful. She had been seen. She had been valued. She was being chosen. Her arc from enduring to choosing was complete. She made her choice. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Plainly." "Yes." He rose, his face transformed by a smile that finally, truly reached his eyes. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. He did not kiss her. Not yet. He simply held her hands and looked at her, as if memorizing the face of the woman who had saved him in more ways than she would ever know. Epilogue. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the study at Kestrel Chase, illuminating the room not with the cold, sterile light of the moon, but with a warm, golden glow. The desk was no longer a mountain of chaos, but an orderly landscape of estate papers, tenant letters, and architectural drawings for a new schoolhouse in Marley. The air smelled of beeswax, old books, and, faintly, of the roses and lavender that now bloomed in abundance beneath the windows. Prudence, Duchess of Kestrel Chase, sat at the desk, reviewing the quarterly accounts. The ledgers were immaculate, her own clear hand filling every page. The estate was not just solvent, it was thriving. The tenants were prosperous, the lands were productive, and the house itself seemed to breathe with a new life. Mrs. Abbott, now a friend as much as a housekeeper, bustled in with a tea tray, her customary sternness softened by a deep and abiding affection for her Duchess. Ambrose entered from the terrace, shrugging off his riding coat. He came to stand behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her hair. "The east pastures look well," he said, his voice a low, contented rumble against her ear. "Yardley is a changed man now that he is free of Carmichael's shadow." "He is a good tenant," Prudence said, leaning back against him. "He simply needed a chance." They were a true partnership. She managed the intricate finances and domestic heart of the estate, her quiet competence a steadying force. He was its public face, its defender, his authority now tempered with a warmth and fairness that had earned him the loyalty of the entire county. Later, they walked in the gardens as the sun began to set. They passed the little herb garden, now a lush, fragrant tapestry of green and silver, its bounty supplying not only their kitchen, but half the village as well. He had never told her that he had watched her from the window in those early days, but she knew. It was one of the many unspoken truths that formed the bedrock of their love. They paused on the lawn, looking back at the great house. The stone, once so cold and gray, seemed to glow in the twilight. Lights were coming on in the windows, one by one, signaling a home that was warm, safe, and alive. Ambrose reached into his coat and brought out a small, familiar object. It was her old, worn leather notebook, the one that had been her shield and her weapon for so long. He had had its broken spine mended and its cover reconditioned. "I believe this is yours," he said softly, placing it in her hands. She opened it. The first few pages still contained the cramped, desperate figures of her aunt's accounts. The rest of the book was filled with the story of Kestrel Chase's revival. It was the story of their beginning. "I have a new one now," she said, her voice soft. She looked from the book to his face, her heart full. "We have a new one." He smiled, that rare, true smile that was still reserved only for her. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Together," he said. It was not a question or a command. It was a statement of fact. Their fact. And as they stood there, with their home glowing behind them and their future stretching before them, it was the only word that mattered. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.